Hello and welcome to the Rest is Football with me, Gary Lineker, and today is a special episode focusing on football and money, specifically what's been happening with Premier League clubs in the transfer market as we start the countdown to the new season. Comes around quickly, doesn't it? Manchester United kick off the new season a fortnight today. That's Friday the 16th of August at home to Fulham before the first round of fixtures is played over that weekend. I'm joined today by Nick Harris, a friend of the podcast, of course, who's been on here before. He helped us to understand what was happening, of course, when Everton were charged and then docked points last season for overspending. Nick regularly writes about football finance and governance issues on his Sporting Intelligence Substack site. And I think we have some mind-boggling and fascinating things to discuss today. What's intriguing is how I think that we think about transfer spending and how it will be affected by clubs under pressure to stay within spending rules. And there have already been some eye-browsing moments already, which we'll get to very shortly. But first, Nick, hope all's well in your world.
Yeah, all very good. Thanks for having me on, Gary.
No, absolute pleasure to have you again. Do you think clubs are going to spend loads? That's the first question, I think.
I think that we are going to see spending going back up again. I mean, the January transfer window just completely died a death this year, but that was in the wake of obviously the Everton and the Forest and the other points deductions and threats of deductions. So I think clubs were sort of very, very nervous about what was actually happening. Oh my goodness, we've suddenly been docked points. The Premier League are really starting to crack down on the rules, and it died a death. But we can already see this summer. We see some odd transfers, but we're seeing tens of millions of pounds. We've seen Manchester United spend more than £50 million on a teenager who unfortunately has already got injured, but that makes him the fifth most expensive teenager in the world. We are seeing clubs spending money. So yeah, I think we will be back in the multi-billion pound territory this summer.
Why do you think that's changed now? Because it's only a few months ago, isn't it, since the January transfer window where pretty much nothing happened.
Yeah, I think because there are some clubs who are obviously quite confident that they're fine in terms of spending ability. They don't feel like they're going to be breaching the spending regulations, so they're going to be spending. Obviously, we've got Sir Jim Ratcliffe at Manchester United, who wants to really start making an impression this season. Manchester City are obviously got lots of income and therefore money to spend. Tottenham have been traditionally well run. So there are clubs who will not necessarily be spending or be spending in strange ways, which we'll come to. But I just think that there are clubs who are who've made themselves much more aware of what they need to be doing to stay within the rules and are confident. And therefore, the Premier League, as we know, is the richest league in the world with the biggest TV deals in the world, huge amounts of commercial income. So there's a lot of money there. And so there is money to spend. And I think it's just, the nervousness seems to have abated amongst most of the clubs.
Will some of the clubs still be worried about PSR? And perhaps for a start here, tell us what it was actually brought in to control in the first place.
Yeah. So PSR was brought in. The PSR rules, profit and sustainability rules, were brought in to basically stop clubs hemorrhaging too much money. And the rules I really try and simplify this, but clubs were allowed to lose £105 million over 3 years. And that really is to sort of stop clubs harming themselves. That's it in a nutshell. And we have to remember that the Premier League is a collection of clubs. It's a collective. So the clubs themselves agreed to bring these rules in. They wanted to have rules that meant that you couldn't just spend. That's why they were brought in the first place. I think we're in a position now with the points deductions last season and that there's a review underway, and I suspect we will have a new and different set of regulations around spending coming in. We don't know what they will be yet exactly, but there might be a spending cap, say, for example, on wages, or something that falls more into line with what UEFA do, which caps the amount that you spend on wages, agents' fees, and transfer fees at a percentage of your turnover. All this is yet to be decided, but basically the rules came in the first place to stop clubs from harming themselves, and everyone agreed to them.
Is there a sense, though, now that it's come to the point where it's actually restricting clubs challenging the current elite, in the sense that, if you've got wealthy owners, take Newcastle, for example. Now it's a state-owned football club, really, which, but that train left the station a long time ago. Whatever you feel about that, it's made it very difficult for them to compete with clubs that are already in that financial position and strong.
Well, there is that argument, and I certainly see that some people can make that argument that, if you might have a smaller club like Bournemouth or Brighton or somebody who suddenly want to be able to spend loads of money, although those clubs don't want to do that. They seem to want to be doing it much more organically, like Brighton. But the flip side of this, Gary, that you can't organically grow without chucking loads and loads of money at it is, well, your club, Leicester City, in that miracle season. I know it's a one-off. It was the most unlikely thing that's ever happened in the history of English football, but they won the Premier League. They got into the Champions League. Fine, they haven't sustained it, but they did do it. You can organically grow. You look at Brentford. Look at Brentford, who've gone from like the fourth division to being sort of pretty stable Premier League club. Yes, they're not knocking on the door of the title, but look at Brighton, who within the last 20 years were within minutes of being relegated to the non-league. You can grow organically. On the flip side of this, just because you shed loads of money does not guarantee that you are going to win anything. Case in point, Manchester United, since Fergie left, they have spent enormous amounts of money and not done it. So I think it's like most things, we can and should see both sides of the argument. And another club you would point to is Tottenham. Tottenham Champions League finalists. They've been in the title race in recent memory. So I think there are two sides to the argument, and it's important to see it. The other point I should make about the sheer volume of money that is now in the Premier League, and we're at the point where even the poorest Premier League club is on a par with most of the richest football clubs in the world in terms of income. So you've got Brighton and other clubs being in the same transfer market as Milan and Juventus and whatever, because they are so wealthy. And this is also reflected generally in the transfer market. If we go back, and tell me if I'm boring you, but if we go back just a decade to a summer when I did a study of what was being spent in the transfer market in 2013-14, goalkeepers on average were moving to Premier League clubs for about £3.3 million each, defenders 4 million, midfielders 5, midfielders around 8.5, and strikers averaging closer to 9.5, and 600 million or thereabouts was spent in that summer. Last summer, that was £2.5 billion nearly. And those individual players, people don't think anything now of spending £20 million on a centre half or £50 million on a midfielder. The club that I support, Southampton, we signed Taylor Harwood-Bellis from Manchester City for £20 million. Players cost tens of millions of pounds now.
Therefore, do you feel perhaps that 105 million is a bit outdated now?
Whether the amount is outdated, yes, it probably is. But whether the actual system is outdated, yes, it probably is. So I think there's something more fundamental at play here about the clubs deciding how they do want to work. I think what most clubs don't want is to be in a situation where there's literally a free-for-all, where the clubs that are either state-owned or backed by the apparatus of state can literally spend whatever they want. Because, we really will get to a point where just those clubs are going to be consistently in the running. And we're already in a situation where Manchester City have won 6 out of the last 7 titles. Newcastle's really quite a curious case at the moment because, of course, they haven't been spending, and now they've been selling players to meet PSR. So I think there are important decisions that the Premier League and their clubs need to make about what kind of league do they want to be. Do you want to be a competitive league where, you use levers to try and influence competitive balance? Or do you just want to let clubs spend loads of money? I think these are big decisions, and these are decisions for the Premier League and the big clubs and their owners.
Yeah. You mentioned 2 clubs earlier there, and I can feel people screaming, or not screaming, but fans probably of Tottenham saying, we haven't won anything since pretty much you played. And and the other thing is Leicester fans, we're worried. Every Leicester fan is worried about whether they're going to get a point deduction. Have you got any inside information on that for us, Nick, at all?
No, not particularly. I mean, I think it's well known Leicester are under the spotlight for overspending. They're kind of treading a line where they have, for a number of months, been sort of apparently making the case that the EFL do not have jurisdiction to investigate them because they're now going to the Premier League, but the Premier League don't have jurisdiction to investigate them because they've just come out of the EFL. I do think they are going to have some problems with the PSR. Quite exactly when those charges might be laid, if at all, I don't know. But yeah, I think they are one of potentially 6 clubs who are at risk of having PSR problems.
Which are the other 5?
Okay, so you've got Aston Villa, you have Newcastle, Everton, Forest, Chelsea, and Leicester is the 6th one. So those are the 6, but that's not to say they will all have problems, because they've been doing things to try and avoid problems with some of their transfer business in the run up to the end of June. And that's not to say that there will be other clubs who might also run into problems depending on how they behave.
Most notably, of course, Manchester City. Where do they stand at the moment?
Obviously, City are not in trouble in terms of PSR, but City have got these 115 charges pending against them. It's our understanding that the tribunal hearing that will try to resolve that one way or another will start in November. No official confirmation, nobody saying anything, but the suggestion is that will be in November, and it will last weeks, maybe 4 weeks, maybe 6 weeks, and then it will be months more before we get a verdict. But that's been, what are we now? We're in 2024. It was 2018 when the Premier League started investigating. We will have passed the 6th anniversary of the beginning of that investigation before we get anywhere close to getting a verdict, which again is expected generally to be sometime in the 2024-25 season, but we don't know.
Looking at different matters, you've already talked about transfer fees and the transfer window in particular, and the fact that clubs are still spending. What are the main changes, do you feel, in the marketplace? I suppose things like the Saudis entering the fray. Yeah,
I mean, that's been quite interesting. The fact that clubs can suddenly, get tens of millions of pounds by selling players to Saudi Arabia, and quite a lot of players have obviously gone there. So that's one trend. I mean, if you talk about wider trends in the transfer market over the years of the sort of players that attract big money, and we only need to look at last summer to see that Chelsea under Todd Bowley spending £1 billion. They spent 106 million on Enzo Fernandez and 100 million or more on Moises Caicedo, and Arsenal, decided to spend 100 million on Declan Rice, and new owners with deep pockets like Bowley at Chelsea, but obviously, as has happened at Manchester City and at the start at Newcastle, that's one factor. But there are some other sort of interesting trends over the years, and these things will change. But in terms of in-demand players, if we go back to Claude Makelele at Chelsea, so impressive in his job that it became known throughout football as the Makelele role. And then obviously at your club later, you had N'Golo Kante. Now, so what we've actually seen in the last sort of 10, 15 years is that pretty much every top flight football club needs and has to have a defensive, a really high caliber defensive midfielder. Yeah. It's also the way that the game has progressed.
What's the world coming to, Nick?
When defensive midfielders are worth more than strikers. I mean,
exactly. The game's gone mad.
The thing is, though, Gary, I mean, when you look at the sort of the valuations of those top players in the world, and clearly you've got people like Jude Bellingham is the most valuable player, in the world by estimated transfer fee, and Haaland is well up there, and Phil Foden is also somebody who would be worth sort of more than 200 million in the transfer market, and Vinicius Junior with Bukayo Saka and Alvarez and Lamine Yamal, who was so impressive at the Euros, of course, not that far behind. But players like Valverde at Real Madrid, Warren Zaire-Emery at PSG, Rodri, of course, at Manchester City, the man who's forgotten how to lose football matches, apart from in the FA Cup final. These guys are also amongst the most highly valued players in the world. So that's one development. Another trend I noticed when I've sort of done studies of which positions and which things, which players become most valuable is particularly left-sided defenders. And again, look at England at the Euros. Where are England's left-sided defenders? Why has English football over the last decade produced such an astonishing array of talent in attacking positions? Why don't England have 6 or 8 really high-class left fullbacks, to choose from? So, and that is also reflected in valuation. So if you do get left backs that come onto the market, they tend to cost more than right backs and other positions. So that's another trend. But these things, as you know, Gary, football evolves. So that's where we are.
I'll tell you why it is, Nick, because I don't know about you, but whenever you were playing as a youngster and you got to pick a team, the last choice was always the left back.
Was it? I was always picked last at right back, Gary. And the joke was, I was always...
well, you must have been really bad.
Yeah, exactly. I was terrible. And I was actually a right back to the extent that I was right back in the dressing room when everyone else went out to the pitch. But yeah, I don't know. It's an enigma, but left backs are just more valuable because they're rarer. And, that's just a fact.
How does it work, the transfer market, when clubs go into to negotiate, say, a left back who suddenly decides that they're worth more money? Or is it basically because it's like ultimately it falls down like an auction, and if there's more than one club interested, and then the price will spiral like anything else in life?
Exactly. I mean, it's ultimately down to it's a marketplace. So somebody is only worth what someone else is going to pay for them. If you use, I don't know, an analytics company, or you've got, the algorithms that power the transfer business of Brighton or Brentford in particular, then they will be taking into account a number of factors, including a player's age, the amount of games he's played for his club and at what level, hundreds and hundreds of different metrics about their physical abilities and their sprinting power and their pass completion rates and whatever. And also traditional scouting. So, somebody will say, look, we can all see that this player is just bloody brilliant. And if the data backs that up, and then you throw into the mix that if you've got a really exciting young player suddenly emerging, then other clubs are clearly going to look at him. And once you've got 2 or more potential bidders in any auction, and effectively the transfer market is an auction, then the chances of that, of the price going up are high. Equally, you might have a situation like the Todd Boehly ownership situation at Chelsea, where they've come in and they've sort of promised to spend loads of money on players and development and stuff, and they just go on this crazy spending spree where they're just buying loads of players and paying whatever they're being asked to pay. So, I mean, that's how the market works. Yeah,
explain to us again, Nick, how Chelsea have managed to kind of stay away from the PSR problems as of yet, given the amount of money that they've invested.
Because for a start, I don't want to get it to become too complicated, but for example, most of these players that they bought during that enormous spending spree of a year or 18 months, they put them on really long contracts. So 6-8 year contracts in some cases. And what happens in terms of the way that you account for the buying of players in your financial accounts is you amortize the transfer fee, which means you spread it over the length of the contract. So if you've got Fernandes, for example, who costs, let's say, for sake of argument and easy mathematics, £100 million, and you amortize that over the 8 years of his contract, then really you're only spending £12.5 million a year on that player rather than the 100 million. So if you say they spent £1 billion in 1 year and you actually amortize that over 6, 7, 8 years, they're not spending £1 billion in that year. They're actually, but for amortization purposes, only spending 100 million each year for the next year. It piles up pressure and problems down the road, but they're not obviously that bothered about that. And the second thing that they've been doing is they have been selling they have sold a lot of players as well, which also helps them balance the books.
Clubs have found a bit of a loophole, haven't they? Some slightly suspect goings on, little triangulation of transfers and stuff. Explain, Nick.
So we talked earlier about these 6 clubs who we think either are in danger of PSR, failing PSR, or are worried that they might be: Villa, Everton, Forest, Newcastle, Chelsea and Leicester. And we had a really strange phenomenon in the last week or 10 days of June, where those 6 clubs started to buy and sell players from each other for quite eye-watering amounts of money, given that most of those players were young players who in some cases had not played football in the Premier League before or had played very limited games. And when you said it sort of looks a bit strange, it does, but we must stress that it's not illegal, it's not against the rules. I don't know for sure whether the Premier League will be investigating any of these deals, although it has been reported that in some cases they might be. But let's just run through. So Villa, for example. Villa did a lot of transfer business, or have already done a lot of transfer business with other clubs in this group, with Everton and Chelsea. Villa's biggest buys have included fairly straightforward transfers of Onana, 50 million from Everton, and Ian Matson, 37.5 from Chelsea. But, some of their sales do look a bit strange. Amari Kellyman to Chelsea for £19 million for an 18-year-old with 2 Premier League appearances, and Irogbenon to Everton for £9 million, age 21, after 12 appearances in 3 years. And the salient point here is that the sales that Villa have been making have been youth products that they're selling. And with a youth product, the important part is the profit from that youth product, because they don't have any amortizing fee or whatever. They don't have any, original purchase price to make back, is that the sales of youth products go straight to the bottom line. And within this group of 6 clubs, these deals were, and we'll go through a few more, were all being done in the run up to the 30th of June, which is the end of the financial year. So on the at face value, it seems very clear that clubs are selling players to each other for transfer fees that are probably higher than the market rates would suggest they would be, in order to help themselves with potential PSR problems. So we've already said Everton bought those 2 players from Villa in the end of June. Forest bought Elliot Anderson from Newcastle, where he was a youth product, for about £35 million on the 30th of June. And they sold a 30-year-old keeper to Newcastle, reportedly, for £20 million. So that helps out Newcastle and Forest, because they're both making money and also limiting the amount that they're spending. Newcastle obviously bought a player for Forest, sold a player to Forest, both on the 30th of June. And they bought Lewis Hall, a Chelsea youth product. And I know he's played football and he's been playing games, but he's 18, £28 million. Newcastle, who we obviously know have publicly said that they're going to be struggling with financial issues. That's come from Darren Eales, their chief executive, over the last few months. Sold Yankuba Minta, a 20-year-old winger they bought a year ago for £5.5 million, to Brighton for £30 million. He's never played a minute for Newcastle and spent last season on loan at Feyenoord. And among Chelsea's buys are Kellyman from Villa, 19 million, and Kiernan Dewsbury-Hall, a Leicester youth product from Leicester for 30 million, while selling Matson to Villa and Hall to Newcastle. And obviously, Gary, you'll be aware of Dewsbury-Hall's value. Yeah. I don't mean financial value, but as a football player, why on earth would Leicester want to sell such a player? And the fact is, if they didn't have a financial imperative to do so, they wouldn't. And then you've obviously got Leicester. They also bought an 18-year-old Michael Golding from Chelsea and sold Dewsbury-Hall. So you've got all these deals happening between this group of plugs at values that seem on the face of it a bit strange. But I should stress this is not illegal, but we are in loophole territory.
Yeah, it looks like a little bit of a loophole. Because I suppose in many ways, when clubs kind of do this sort of thing before, it would have been a swap deal. You know, you take him, we'll take him, but that wouldn't help your PSR.
Exactly. And the way that the PSR is being helped now is you're selling young players for large amounts of money, quite possibly more than they're technically worth, and you're banking that to your bottom line while you're buying players that you can then amortize over years. So if you're buying a £30 million player, whatever, you can amortize that. So it's basically a way of easing your financial problems.
Yeah, my only a slight concern along this is that, you know, young players are kind of been treated like they're at a meat market or something. They're just being moved around. I suppose, I mean, because that's how it was when I was first playing in football. If the club said, right, you're off to go and play for Leeds United, you went and played for Leeds United. Otherwise, you'd rot in the reserves and stuff like that. Yeah. So is there a sense here that players are being moved around perhaps against their will? Or I suppose they wouldn't necessarily do that. And I suppose, you know, their salaries will be put up and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think like you said, Gary, hasn't this always been the case at football, that footballers, you know, don't necessarily have agency over their careers in a practical sense? Of course, you know, if you were told, right, we want to sell you to such and such, you could have dug your heels in at a certain point and said, well, I'm not going. I've got a 3-year contract or whatever. But the practical reality is that I think this has always happened. And it's just this is happening now for maybe different reasons, you know, which is being driven by a financial necessity to meet PSR, as opposed to a footballing reason that such and such a coach doesn't fancy you anymore. But I think it's always happened. And
having said that, Nick, I think there'll be a lot of players that have obviously on huge contracts that never want to leave a football club because they've got a long contract, and that could be a situation that possibly someone like Chelsea finds themselves in future years, when you can't disload them because another club's not prepared to pay that salary. Therefore, why would you move?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's one of the problems Chelsea have stacked up for themselves for future years, that they've got all these players, Mudryk and Fernandes and Caicedo and all the other players they signed who are on these long and presumably pretty lucrative contracts. And in future years, that could be a problem for them, particularly if those players don't necessarily fulfil the potential that Chelsea thought they had when they signed them.
Do you think they'll try and block this possible loophole?
No, in short. And the reason is, I think the fact that this has been happening is so glaringly obvious that it will just be another reminder that the whole system has to change. They have to reform the rules in and of themselves because, you know, it's not working. The system is not working. And as I said, probably the most likely thing is some kind of salary cap or some sort of percentage limit on what you can spend rather than a specific £105 million target.
When you say salary cap, I presume you mean the overall spending on salaries rather than a one person's contract. You can't earn more than this much as a player.
Yeah, absolutely. So, for example, what has been suggested, and this is obviously still to be confirmed, they're talking about it, is that, for example, you might have a salary cap of £400 million. So any Premier League club can spend up to £400 million on wages. That, for example, might be what happens. And it might, the actual figure might be anchored against multiples of what the lowest, the smallest earning club in the division have in terms of revenue, so that you can't get to a situation where you've got a club at the bottom of the table who maybe has revenues of 150 million, but your salary cap is $1 billion, 6 times of that. It will be fewer multiples than that. But yeah, you're right. It will be, okay, you could spend £400 million on wages this season and nobody can spend more than that. And I think we're already at the point, I think there's 2 clubs, certainly Man City in the 22-23 season became the first Premier League club to spend more than 400 million on wages. But yeah, it would be a cap on all player wages, not on an individual. I mean, it's a lot of money. It is a lot of money.
It is. And I know people are fascinated by, obviously, salaries of footballers. And so what are the big players earning now, Nick?
Well, obviously, the highest earning footballers, in the world. I mean, you go to Saudi Arabia and look at what Cristiano Ronaldo and some of the players in Saudi are reportedly earning at. Yeah. The big clubs around Europe, and obviously there's been a bit of a financial sort of cutback at the two giants in Spain in recent years for various reasons. But at those two clubs and at the sort of the biggest five in England, because, well, actually, I suppose the biggest four, because Arsenal and Tottenham are still some way behind City, United, Chelsea, and who was the other one? Liverpool. So at the big four, at the biggest four spenders in England, the two in Spain, plus Bayern, Juve, the top earners will be earning upwards of £20 million a year. So we're talking about
it's a living.
Yeah, it is a living, and but also there's a calculation there made by the clubs that they are worth the money because they are delivering trophies, or they are getting the club into the latter stages of the Champions League, and therefore earning the clubs, 150 million pounds from Champions League participation. And if you are amongst that group of the best players in the world, and you know that there's a market for your talents, then then you're going to earn a lot of money. The average wages across all divisions in different leagues are obviously much lower than the superstars who are making the top money. But if you're a general Premier League player, you're still going to be earning a pretty decent living.
It's come on since the 20 quid a week I started out at Leicester City.
Is that what you were on?
Well, actually, I lied there. It was actually £21 because I got 16 quid and a separate envelope with a fiver in it because I was a local lad from my mum, but my mum wouldn't take it. So I actually earned 21 quid a week. But I was only 16 then. And then by the time I left Leicester, though, I was on 400 quid a week.
So what year was that you left?
I left in 85. So that's 40 years ago, almost. Yeah. So it's gone on a little bit.
The average basic salary in the English top division in that season, 84-85, was £450.
Yeah. So I was at Leicester at the time. So
yeah. But obviously, with bonuses and other things, it would be higher than that. But the average salary, basic salary in the Premier League now, is more than 60,000. And when you add bonuses and signing on fees and stuff, it's more like 5 million quid a year and upwards. And I'm talking about, players at mid-table clubs will routinely be on 5 million now.
One final topic I'd love to discuss because it's a thing that interested me since it came to light a little bit more last season of multi-club ownership.
Yeah.
It came to light because we were told pretty much early last season, I think, that if two sides that were owned by the same owners couldn't compete together in the Champions League, and obviously there were two cases going into next season where that would have applied. So one of the teams wouldn't be allowed to play, but that was overlooked in the end. Explain that rule first, and then I want to come to the whole complexities of multi-club ownership.
Yeah, so multi-club ownership has exploded in the last five years. So you went from dozens of clubs 6, 7, 8 years ago to now there's, well, at my latest count, there was more than 700 football clubs are part of multi-club groups. And the biggest and most successful of those groups is the City Football Group. So we can get into the potential conflicts of interest with multi-club football. But as you said, one of the most obvious is if you have two teams playing in the same competition, European competition, owned by the same group, then is there a risk that somebody high up in that group is going to say, I want this team to win, or tell this manager to do that? The imminent conflicts of interest for the coming season are that Manchester City's parent company, the City Football Group, obviously own Manchester City, who are going to be in the Champions League, and Girona, who were one of the big success stories of last season. So there's a potential conflict of interest there. Should these two clubs be playing in the same elite competition when ultimately the people pulling the strings at the top of that group are the same people. And there's another conflict also involving a club from Manchester United, who will be playing in the Europa League in the same competition as Nice, who are also owned by basically Ineos. Yes, I mean, there was a suggestion that this won't be allowed. And what's happened in the past, for example, when Red Bull, Salzburg and Leipzig, also owned by the Red Bull Corporation, there were suggestions that UEFA would clamp down and one of them have to be kicked out. But basically it was all, it was fudged and they were allowed to play in the same competitions. And lo and behold, during the Euros, while everyone was focusing on how exciting Spain were and how boring England were, UEFA released a statement on the 5th of July basically saying, oh, it's all fine, there aren't conflicts of interest, and City and Girona can both play in the Champions League, and United and Nice can both play in the Europa League. And UEFA gave as their reasons, somewhat ridiculously in my opinion, that the clubs were able to demonstrate that changes that UEFA had asked them to make brought them into compliance with multi-club ownership, considering that no one is simultaneously involved directly or indirectly in any capacity whatsoever in the management, administration and or sporting performance of more than one club participating in a UEFA competition, and no one has control or decisive influence over more than one club participating in a UEFA competition. I just simply do not see, apart from maybe in a really technical sense, how that can be true. There are people who are very powerful and have huge influence at the top of both of those ownership groups. How is it logical to suddenly say that they no longer have control of the clubs that they own and control? So it's been fudged. They'll play on. Yeah,
and the danger, because fans will be saying, oh, the clubs will try anyway. But I suppose if you've got a situation where one club is going really well in the competition, they're definitely going to qualify, etc. But then you end up playing the club that's also owned by the same owners, and it's in their interest to get through to the next stage by getting a result against them that doesn't damage the team at the top. I mean, I know it's changed because there's a new format, but the same logic still applies. If you'd have said last season, it would be easy to explain because there's 4 clubs in a group. Say, Manchester City and Girona got kind of came out the lot in the same group, and then in the last game, Man City have already got 12 points, but Girona need a win to go through. Then that's open to kind of dodgy goings on.
Absolutely. And that is one of a number of conflicts of interest in multi-club ownership. I think FIFA and UEFA sort of not took their eye off the ball, but kind of just didn't notice. They were kind of asleep at the wheel as multi-club ownership went from a few dozen clubs in the world to 700. And they really don't know how to deal with it. I think that there's conflicts around that arise from transfers as well between multi-club groups. There's conflicts. The obvious one, like you said, is exactly that scenario where you had 2 clubs and they're playing each other and one's already qualified for whatever and the other one needs a result.
Yeah.
We're not suggesting that people will corruptly go out and lose a game or whatever, but it's the possibility of that happening that is the problem. It's not about being clean, but it's also about being seen to be clean. The multi-club thing, I just don't know how the governing bodies are going to resolve it. I know that, again, talking specifically, I was going to say Girona, but you've obviously now corrected me that it's Girona. Is it Girona?
Well, it depends. I mean, if Girona, we'll say in Spanish, but it's Girona in Catalan. So okay. You can either way is fine. I think. Tell me about why people want multi-clubs. Why the owners? What's the draw for them?
The basic logic is economies of scale for a start. So, for example, if you have City Football Group have a scouting database, for example, that's state of the art and has got tens of thousands of players' information in there. If you've got that database and you are using it across your 13 clubs, then it just gives you that ability. With City as well, having those 13 clubs that they've got, they are geographically, they're everywhere. They're in Brazil, they're in England, they're in Spain, they're in Belgium, they're in France, they're in Japan, they're in America. So that means they have football clubs operating within vastly different geographical areas. So they're very much across talent in all parts of the world at any given time. So I think that's basically it, that it gives you a geographical reach, and also all the different things, whether it's sponsorship or scouting or technical expertise or coaching habits or whatever. You can roll them all out across clubs, and you'll have a sort of, there'll be a sort of uniformity to what you do. And in the case of City Football Group, obviously very, very high standards. So it's amazing when you look at the coaches who move around the City Group. Patrick Vieira, for example, was at Man City and he was at New York City FC. And coaches move around. Coaches sort of follow the blueprint, really, of the way that they play. Most of those clubs play in the blue shirts, or an approximation of them that Manchester City play in. There's obviously a club in Melbourne as well. So I think that is the sort of logical reason behind it. But a lot of these groups are just not very successful, and they don't do it very well. And the reasons for them being in it are much less obvious when you're hemorrhaging money on a load of clubs that are not successful. There's a group, 777 Partners, who were, apparently on the brink of buying Everton, and that deal collapsed. When you look at the clubs in their ownership group, they haven't been particularly successful at all. There's some pretty massive ethical questions over their behaviour of that company. And it's not obvious in some cases why people are buying multiple football clubs. In some cases, it's a bit more obvious when they're small groups. Stan Kroenke, the owner of Arsenal, has got Colorado Rapids in America, for example. The Manchester United owner, he's got 2 or might be 3 clubs now. And again, another aspect of it is that one of your smaller club could maybe act as a feeder club to your bigger club. I think in the City Football Group, on the face of it, it very much appears that Manchester City is the mothership, and the rest of that group work in service to Manchester City. So as and when they discover gems in other locations or in lower clubs, if those players eventually become good enough, they will, go up the ladder and become Manchester City players. So that's another thing.
Hasn't that happened with Savio at Girona?
Yeah, so he was bought from Atletico Mineiro in Brazil in, I think it was 2022, for about €6.5 million. And Mineiro, when they sold him, he's now a Brazilian international winger. But when they sold him, they announced that they had sold that player to City Football Group as opposed to a specific club. And then he was placed with Troyes in France. And they've had all sorts of problems, including massive financial problems. And this summer, he's now moved from Troyes, which is a City Football Group club, to Manchester City for £32 million. So yeah, that and those sort of deals. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of players in the last decade who have moved around City Football Group, often signed by Manchester City and then not played a game in years, or in all the time they're there, and they've maybe gone to loan at Girona, or they've gone to Troyes, or they've gone to Lommel, or they've gone to other groups. And ultimately, if they're good enough, they end up playing for City. Most of them sort of they get sold on to other clubs who are not as good as City. And frankly, most clubs in the world are not as good as City.
Well, it's very hard to be a player that's good enough for Manchester City. What should we be worried about with multi-club ownership, aside from the fact that if they were drawn together, which we've already talked about? Is there a general concern? Is there a danger?
Well, the danger is really the lack of transparency about why certain players are getting moved between clubs, and obviously this financial aspect of can you basically rig the transfer market by selling a player from one of your clubs to another club for a load of money? For example, let's not use a specific example of an actual club for legal reasons, but let's just say you're a club in the group that's not doing very well and has got terrible financial problems, and you sell one of your players to another club in the group for loads of money. That's just sort of quite clearly a conflict of interest and probably shouldn't be happening. So let's use the example of, there was this suggestion earlier this year that, Newcastle, who are demonstrably having financial problems, would suddenly be able to sell a load of their players to Saudi Arabia because Saudi Arabia effectively owns Newcastle, and they could sort out their financial problems by selling a load of players to a country that effectively owns them. Is that fair on all the other Premier League clubs who might be having financial problems? The answer is no. And it's the same principle.
Yeah. Okay. It's something else to be monitored, Nick. Thank you so much for your time. It's been fascinating, as always, and very enlightening for most of us that don't understand these things. But thank you very much, Nick.
Thanks, Gary. And have you had a holiday since the Euros, Gary? Because I know that, Big Meeks and Alan are conspicuously absent. Are they still on the sun lounges?
They have got their trotters up in the sunshine. I'm holding the fort. To be honest, I've been away for long, and I just wanted to spend a bit of time with my dog, and he's down here by my left-hand side. So I'm quite gladly at home for a few weeks.
But it sounds like you had a great time at the Euros.
Yeah, it was fun. The Euros was great, and apart from obviously the final was a bit disappointing, but the best team won, no question about that. And It was good broadcasting with the BBC. We did lots of podcasts. It was great fun, Nick.
Yeah, I was actually in Dusseldorf for the Switzerland game, and I know afterwards everyone was still sort of saying how drab that game was. Actually, in the flesh, in that stadium with that atmosphere, and particularly obviously the penalties, but the match itself, I didn't think it was quite as terrible. Well, it wasn't quite as terrible as the three previous matches. But yeah, it was.
No, the Switzerland game I thought we performed okay. I think we did all right. It was an interesting tournament in the sense that, particularly broadcasting it, because whilst England were progressing, it was quite a tough watch at the time. So it was quite difficult to know how to pitch it. But obviously, when you win, you win. And the atmosphere within the stadiums was absolutely fantastic wherever you went. And I think that was probably the highlight of the tournament, not just England fans, but fans from, Scotland and Turkey and Austria and the Netherlands. And it was just fantastic. It was good, that side of it, for sure.
And there's always next time.
There is. And I'm sure there'll be a next time for you, Nick, because we definitely need you on our podcast from time to time to explain things. But for now, that's it for this episode. So goodbye from me.
And thank you for having me.